I believe that the new political coalitions that are going to make up the two major poles in American society are effectively a liberal cosmopolitan coalition of people that believe in free trade and dynamism and openness and innovation and pluralism, versus populists on both the far left and the far right. You could think about horseshoe theory, right? You've got kind of people like Hassan and Nick Fuentes, both on the kind of the same team. A lot of, in many cases.
Boom. Okay, now everybody can see us. I am sorry for my surroundings. I'm on the Pokrovsk front, and so there's not like a lot of recording studios out here near the Pokrovsk front. So I'm in a little village house in an undisclosed location. So excuse my unbecoming surroundings. Hope you're doing well, man.
No, I hope you're doing well. That's what I was going to say, man. I know you've been putting yourself in harm's way for the last couple. How long have you been there now?
Well, I started in April of 2022. So, you know, once this year is over, that'll be my third year and I'll be going to my fourth.
I understood. How long have you been there this trip? Have you been there for a couple weeks now?
You know, I've been here for a couple months now, and for this year, I think I've done 7, going on 8 months.
Good Lord, man. Yeah, well, thanks for everything you're doing. And I appreciate you taking the time to still pay attention to what's going on in the United States. I know it's hard to avoid. And this has been an absolutely insane year. So I'm ready for the next week to be over. I'm sure you are as well.
Absolutely.
I'm sure many Ukrainians are as well. So, no, man, I appreciate you taking the time and bringing me on.
Yeah, you know, the thing that's interesting is, you know, I thought in a way, like, you know, the front line comes with its own problems, but it's a distraction away from American politics, which is its own pleasure in a strange way. But it isn't, because all the soldiers I talk to are like, so what's going to happen? So what's happening with the election? Are you Trump or Harris? And it's weird having that same conversation with nearly every unit I go around. There's always one soldier that asks about it because, you know, it's they're heavily dependent upon American aid. Like 50% of their military aid comes from the United States. And even with that, in the current situation, the Russians are rapidly taking southern Donetsk right now with high losses. But, you know, they are advancing due to ammunition shortages and equipment shortages. And we all know that the current situation means that until the election's over and a new president sworn in, there is no foreign aid being approved.
Yep.
So, you know, that's the situation as it is. So it being on a razor's edge kind of means the government can't really plan, and all of Europe really can't plan until the election's over. It seems like every conversation about what the future is and what the future of, you know, war planning, what the future of aid, what the future of Europe's defense plans are, all hinges on the next 6 days and who's going to end up being the next president of the United States. And it couldn't be a closer race.
Yeah, I mean, part of me feels like the polling is going to be off. I mean, I've seen a lot of people indicate, I'm like, it's the disparity between the energy between the two campaigns is very significant. And I've seen a lot of very, you know, well-respected pollsters saying the polls are going to get this wrong. The polls are going to get this wrong. It's going to be a landslide one way or the other. I mean, I'm in deep south of Tennessee, and I just genuinely have a hard time believing that Trump is on his way to a landslide victory. The energy out here seems less than it was in 2020 and 2016. And I'm from the deep south. I live and breathe with many of these people, and I know that a lot of them are making the same decision I am, which I know, Dylan, you and I have spoken about this before. I've never voted for a major party candidate in my life. You know, I've always voted third party, and I've always kind of cast a protest vote. And this is the first year in my life that I've decided not to do that the stakes are too high. Because I do agree with you. I think that, I mean, for Europeans, and I have many friends in Europe, they look at it as you know, America's going to decide our future in a lot of ways. Like our security is going to be tied up in this. But I think I mean, we're basically talking about whether the liberal world order is going to continue in its current form, or whether the authoritarians are going to hijack the world's most powerful and strong democracy and economic system, right? And so it is absolutely existential. That's why I say cannot wait for next week to be over.
Yeah, I mean, Europe is not in a position to provide Ukraine with the munitions necessary for victory. And that's not to say that Europe cannot provide more. They absolutely can. In fact, they already are providing more financially than the United States, despite what many partisans might say. The math is clear. But they do not have the defense capacity. They do not have the artillery production. They do not have the manufacturing base. And it is going to take a good few more years for them to get anywhere close to what is necessary. And the United States is just ahead of the curve on that. And that's not to say that America's at a state where they should be. I mean, we've spent the last few decades fighting, small jihadi groups in caves, and the type of weapons and, warfare that you need for that is much more precision based, is much smaller in scale, even though it's wild to think about how expensive those wars were and say smaller in scale, but it is smaller in scale than what we're seeing in Ukraine, the amount of artillery that's needed. And so, I mean, it is crucial that the United States continues to supply aid, even for, in my mind, Trump's big vision of ending the war, of like 24-hour deals. Because Trump's like, he's the art of the deal guy. He's the deal maker. And that you do not go into negotiations undercutting your base of support. You don't go into negotiations undercutting your leverage. And if you're going into negotiations saying we're going to end the war in 24 hours, I'm sick of sending aid to Ukraine, I don't want to send anymore. Like, then the Russians are like, okay, so you've already tapped out. You've got the same mentality as the Taliban. Like, we just got to wait like another year and this is all over. And that's like the crucial difference between Harris's strategy in negotiating with the Russians, which I don't think is particularly complex. I don't think she's a foreign policy expert, but I know that she'll listen to foreign policy experts. I know she'll listen at least slightly to the people who at least know a little bit about the issue. Whereas on the other side, I don't know if Trump genuinely believes that he can just negotiate an end to the war in 24 hours because he's friends with Putin. I know that Trump really prioritizes these personal relationships, personal politics. Even when you look at his books, even though the art of the deal was ghostwritten, it does come from him, generally speaking. He really prioritizes these personal relationships. But I mean, nation states are more complex than the personality of Putin himself and him being friendly to Trump. And man, I'm nervous. I'm nervous. I'm honestly not as hopeful as you are. I think it's a real toss up. I know that the Harris campaign has more energy, but I also know that the majority of Americans don't believe the country's headed in the right direction. And when you talk to people about things like, and even putting aside because of course the Biden administration has been perfect, but even if we concentrate on accomplishments, like, people blame Biden for the cutting of the child tax credit. People are not particularly energetic about going and researching exactly why the popular policies that were implemented and taken away, why they failed. And people will just blame whatever the current state of affairs is on the current administration, even if much of the current state of affairs is due to, just like throwing like logs into the gears of what made these policies work, making sure that they don't get passed or they get taken away, like with the child tax credit. So I'm really nervous about this election. The polls are tight, and the polls have a history of undercutting or like not well predicting like Donald Trump support. And so I'm going to be nervous up until election night.
I mean, me too. But obviously Kamala coming in with that kind of incumbent baggage, which is absolutely the case, right? She's kind of carrying Joe Biden's legacy on her shoulders. That's what she's got to do as, being his VP. There are good things too, to be hopeful about. Like, we had one of the best job reports we've seen in years this last month. Inflation is back down. Gas prices are back to pre-pandemic or near pre-pandemic lows. The economy, GDP growth under Biden has exceeded GDP growth under Trump. If you look at quarterly GDP growth and you strip out COVID. So, part of me feels like, and I talked to Destiny about this the other day, part of me feels like this whole thing is based on the fact that, it feels to me like Trump supporters are kind of living in an alternative universe. Like, I see interviews with them all the time about, I want gas prices to be low again. And I'm like, literally gas prices right now are like the same that they were right before COVID. Like, there's all these dynamics. So when you look at the aggregate, we are moving in the right direction. The question is whether or not people recognize that or just kind of fall.
This is all separate from comparing us to other countries, because post-pandemic, American recovery was much better. Out of the United States, people have a certain envy towards our recovery. But that is not reflected domestically whatsoever.
No, it's not. But I mean, I have hope because I intuitively feel like there is less energy around the Trump campaign. I really have a hard time believing he is getting new voters. Right? He's got this core base. I don't see this core base changing. He maybe gets some on the margins with these kind of weird decisions to reach out to this like crank left RFK group. You know, he's kind of diversifying in that way. But at the same time, he's losing voters on the other side for doing that. The economy's strong. I think a lot of this stuff we see on Twitter and X is astroturfed, like legitimately. I think you've talked about this. We've talked about this publicly. There's obviously Russian influence and foreign influence on Twitter specifically that I think is making this stuff
Wait,
look a lot
you think
more
that Texans don't usually talk about Texas's warm water ports?
Yeah, exactly. And there's so many different examples of this that you could point to. So I don't know. I feel like a lot of that movement is astroturf. Now, listen, we're going to find out. And I have the luxury of living in the United States, right? So I don't have my life on the line based on the decision that's going to be made here. But I'm going in with some cautious optimism. And I do think. I mean, I've seen so many people in like that are from like my camp. People that have spent
The
their
libertarian
entire
camp,
life.
to be clear, because
Yeah,
people might not be
exactly.
familiar with who you are.
That's right. So I spent 15 years organizing in libertarian partisan circles, right? And I know many people that have made the same decision that I
Your
have
name
that are
is, by the
unwilling.
way, because we haven't started with that.
Oh yeah. So hi stream. My name is Josh Eakle. I'm the president of Project Liberal. I've spent about 10 or 15 years organizing in the Libertarian Party and classically liberal space. I was a state chairman for the Libertarian Party for a long time. And the last time I talked to Dylan was after the Mises PAC took over the Libertarian Party and they basically carved it out
And
and
led it
destroyed
to
it.
financial success, and we have the most membership ever, and Gary Johnson's going to be appointed to like Secretary of Defense.
Yeah, sure. It's dude, I mean, I don't want, so I could spend a long time talking about that. They have officially reached the threshold where their fixed costs are higher than their income to the point that they're now in like a death spiral, a financial death spiral.
Are
So
you telling me I'm sorry, but this is kind of funny to me. It's sad, right? Because I do believe there should be libertarians at the edges of society just chanting freedom, because we need to remind ourselves of that as Americans. But
yep.
I'm the idea of the Libertarian Party being in a debt crisis is very
It's
funny
hilarious.
to me.
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, I documented all this online. There was you can draw the lines, right? There are people within the MAGA orbit. They saw what happened in 2020. They saw the Libertarian candidate cover the spread, cost Joe Biden his reelection. There was about $1 million that was poured into the Mises PAC between the years of like 2018 and 2023, 2024. That's a lot of money, Dylan, in the libertarian third party space. That's you could buy the Libertarian Party. I just want you to know for about $250,000, probably less if you're smart. You could take over the whole thing. That's what happened. Now the party's in death spiral financially. They've lost ballot access in all 50 states, and they're not going to have a real legitimate opposition. I mean, their candidates.
That's crazy because they worked so hard for that ballot access. I mean, I know people who dedicated like all of their free time to that.
50 years, man. I mean, that was the culmination of almost 50 years of work. To get 50 state ballot access is incredibly expensive and it's incredibly difficult to keep. And the reason why it's really bad this year is because the current candidate, who, by the way, Chase is a great candidate. He's a great guy. There's some things I disagree with him on, especially related to foreign policy. But I know him personally. He's got a great heart. He's a good person. Okay. And he's got a good set of policy proposals domestically, I think. But he's polling at less than 1%. And the real problem is this: when he runs, and let's say he gets like 0.8% of the vote or something like that, the state parties across the country are going to lose retention, which is actually really one of the more expensive parts of the ballot access calculation. Is you get it, but then you got to run somebody in a statewide race and get above a threshold, like a percentage threshold. Otherwise, they put you back in the beginning and they make you collect all the signatures again. So what's likely to happen, sadly, is they've lost it in like 4 or 5 states. The retention figures won't be there, so they're going to lose it even more next cycle. And then you're talking about $500,000 plus that they're going to need, if not more, millions of dollars in investment,
Which they don't
to
have.
get back, which they don't have, to get back to where they started. So not a fun time in this space to be an electoral libertarian. It's just not a good year.
What do you, and we're going to get into the main topic in a second. But what do you think is the future of the Libertarian Party at current state? Because it feels like they're headed towards a financial cliff. They don't have any break. They don't have any like windfall or like protection for what's about to happen. What happens when the Libertarian Party goes into debt crisis? Do they just like cut their losses and run? Because the Mises Caucus didn't even seem like, they're not excited at all for Chase. It seems like they were not on board. Most of them seemingly wanted to endorse Trump, which kind of goes against, I don't know, the purpose of what a third party is supposed to be.
Yeah, some of them did. I mean, the chairwoman of the party had dinner with Trump, and she's posted publicly, like, I love Chase, our candidate, because he takes votes away from Kamala. Like, she said that publicly. You can go find the tweets. I haven't spent nearly as much time in the last 6 months looking at this as I did for years, but she is basically campaigning for Trump at this point. It's not even a secret, right? And she's the chairwoman of the third largest political party in the country. But to your question, I like to look at it bigger than that, because I look at the Libertarian Party as a reflection of the health of the liberty movement in the United States, right? Because the Libertarian Party is this kind of, it's electoral wing. It's like a group of these highly engaged activists. And I see their fundraising as a reflection of a broader libertarian momentum around the broader set of ideas, right? Because you'd see a correlation there. And we saw a peak in their fundraising and their electoral outcomes in 2016. We saw tapering off in 2020, and we've seen a full objective collapse. Like, I want to say that the fundraising numbers this year are 10 or 20, maybe 30 times less than they were in 2020. And 2020 was a pretty big decline over 2016. But I'm at this, I believe that kind of the libertarian movement, as we've understood it, kind of had its moment in the 2010s after the Tea Party movement kind of came to fruition. And it really, what happened was it got co-opted by right-wing populists in 2016 after Trump took over. And I don't think this really hit real fruition until like 2020, 2021. But I think that like the movement itself is fractured. So you're familiar with Reagan's three-legged stool, right? Like this coalition of kind of conservatives and libertarians against the communist left. That was the political coalition that the libertarian movement grew up in. That was what birthed the libertarian movement in a lot of ways. It was that alliance, right? There's obviously a lot more dynamics to discuss that, but electorally, that's how it was reflected in American politics. So this fusionism between libertarianism and conservatism, and kind of like looking at the Republican Party as their ally, has caused the movement to effectively fracture. Because in 2020 and post, I mean, the Republican Party is objectively morphed into like an authoritarian party. And libertarians seem to be stuck in this old framework of like, no, the right is our friend, but they can't look objectively at the outcomes and the promises, I think, because of that kind of baggage. And then there's this bigger problem, not to talk your ear off on this, about like the libertarian movement at its center has kind of, the uniting force between everyone that came into that movement was really one of two things. It was like skepticism about government. So like, I want to see smaller government. And it was like a disdain for the far left, right? And so what happens was it brought in people like myself, who I kind of think of myself as, I think I told you on the last show, I see myself as kind of like a cosmopolitan liberal. Like I want a fiscal responsibility. I think, rights are universal. I think pluralism is really good. Like I want to see international cooperation and free trade. But it's brought people like me into a political coalition alongside people that are like many of the people in the Mises Pact. These are people that are really intolerant, right? They look at libertarianism and they go, I like libertarianism because it means I can keep X group off my property. And it's like about getting my own rather than expanding the pie, which I think the cosmopolitan mindset is like, I want people to be free because I want to see a world where everyone's got liberty and we've got economic dynamism. But it's also brought in people on the other side who are like, I want to keep my own. I want to keep people out. And so it created this weird fusion of polar opposite types of people. And they brought them into the same coalition. And then Trump, specifically in the last 2 years, has brought all that to a head. And the entire movement is kind of fractured into two camps. And so the future of the movement is not going to be what the old movement was. It's going to be an entirely new, the new movement is going to be entirely different. And that's kind of what I'm spending a lot of time thinking about. But it's an exciting time. It's also a very tumultuous time. I lost a lot of friends. You know what I mean? It's just been a rough
Lost friends. How's that happened?
Well, I mean, here's the thing. When you have So like when we lived in a political framework where we didn't have one candidate that was trying to like overthrow the government. Okay. Let's talk about like 2012. Okay. I've got Mitt Romney, who's kind of a conservative Republican, versus Obama, who wants to spend more, right? That was a protest vote for me when I was 18. It was obvious. It was like, these guys, they have different opinions on how policy should work, but I want something radically different. And there are many people I worked with at that time that looked at that the same way. And they're just like, we're going to opt out and cast our protest vote and go a different way. But as we've gone through this story of Trumpism, and Trump has basically said, I have disdain for America's institutions. I want to tear them all down. The same people that were working alongside of me, so my motivations were different. I was like, I want to see a completely new political movement. Some of these people really did want to see just like an end to the federal government. You could think about these ANCAPs. So like that message might resonate with those people, but it horrifies me. I've got 2 kids. I don't want to see an end to America's full institution. I don't want to see a collapse of our government. I want to see reform. And that has been a line in the sand that I can't cross. So a lot of these people that I might have, say, collected ballot access signatures with 10 years ago, that would not have been a big deal because we weren't having that conversation. We were like, we want somebody to shrink government. And for the ANCAPs, it meant, let's have local feudalism or whatever. And for me, it was like, let's have pragmatic reforming change. That was not a big dividing line for us because we all were like, hey, we're going directionally towards smaller government. But now when it's to a choice where you can have a candidate who has disdain for America's institutions, it's schismed. Like these people just, we can't work. We're not on the same team anymore, because if you're going to vote for somebody who's just going to completely, try to stop the peaceful transfer of power, and that's not a deal breaker for you because you just want to see the ANCAP paradise, or what is the word? Accelerationism. You know what I mean? Like that's not something that I can tolerate. And so that's why I say that there's been this crazy schism, and it's completely changed the nature of our movement over the last 4 years.
Do you think, and I want to get off this topic in a moment, but I find the Libertarian Party, and I'm not a member of the Libertarian Party. I will never be a member of the Libertarian Party, right? But I find it fascinating. I see it as a check on government expansionism in a way, and I think that having, people make fun of like the people like going on stage and like the toaster and licenses and whatever. People make fun of that. But I think that type of, even if it can be nonsensical at times, I think that's important to act as a check. And I need to use it as a moment to reflect, like, do we really need to implement this gun control policy? Do we really need to implement this new regulation on housing when we already have a housing crisis and we need to be building more housing? I use it as a check on myself, and I find it useful. But the party right now, it doesn't seem sustainable. Is this sustainable? And when it crashes, what happens if it crashes?
Yeah, well, I think that it's going to kind of go the way the Green Party did, right? They had some electoral success and then it just sputtered out, and there were these perennial candidates that ran.
What's the Green Party? I'm only familiar with the Jill Stein Party.
Well, please correct me if I'm wrong, and I might look this up to double check. There was a major Green Party candidate in the 2000s, right? It was one of the major candidates that launched their party, and I can't remember his name. He was one of the like major third party candidates, and once I say his name, you're going to get it. It was Howie Hawkins, I think.
Howie Hawkins was like the one different option that one time.
Yeah, and so there are these, so that party and the Constitution, the Reform Party is a great example. Okay, the Reform Party, that was what Ralph Nader's party, that party came out, it was rather big, that it completely sputtered off. But again, I have not read up on my third party politics history, but I can go back and double check this when I get off this call. But yeah, so this happens with third parties. They launch, they've got this big candidate that kind of brings them to national fruition, and then they kind of sputter out and they fracture, and then you might hear about them once every 4 years, right, when they put a candidate up and they're on the ballot in 5 or 10 states. That's kind of where I think it's going right now. And I don't think it's going to have that big of a significant impact on American electoral politics because, honestly, with the exception of 2016, the Libertarian Party has not really crossed that 1% threshold very often. So, at the margins, you could argue it affects swing states. But my whole opinion on that is actually not the same as like some of these mainstream pundits. Like my thought is like, okay, well, people aren't entitled to your vote. So like, just because say Jill Stein or Joe Jorgensen in 2020 got enough votes to cover the spread, that doesn't mean that those votes were going to break for one party or the other. So I don't think it's that common. Like, I don't think it's like an obvious thing that like, oh, Joe Jorgensen made the election tip one way or the other. I think that's the way most of the political pundits look at it. But I'm like, a lot of people just stay home, or they would vote in two different ways. So I actually don't think it's going to make a big difference. It is deeply sad for me because, again, my definition of libertarian is different than what I think that word is becoming. I always looked at libertarianism as a really cosmopolitan ideology based on just individual liberty, like putting that above everything else. And you're right, that can manifest in some weird ways when you got guys on stage saying that, like driver's licenses are crazy. But I think it's a good force to have somebody in mainstream politics that's saying, hey, let's talk about individual liberty above all things. Let's talk about that first. Like, that's our litmus test. Like, how does this affect individual liberty? I think it's a healthy instinct. So having that gone
there's something when people are talking about implementing a new regulation on an issue, for example, gun control, and there's people want to solve an issue. They see school shootings and they want to solve it, and someone comes out like, okay, let's just ban all the guns. It's good to have somebody to come out and say, wait a minute. And even if the opposite position is like, we should have everything, people should be able to own landmines, people should be able to own like grenade launchers that can, like mortars that can shoot 5 miles away. Even if that's like the counterance on the other side, it's a counterweight, and that counterweight is good to check yourself.
Yeah, and I saw someone in your comment saying that it's basically a shade of liberalism, and that is actually true. Like, if you look at, I always say, David Bose, who's a former executive vice president of Cato Institute, did this big speech actually right before he passed away about how libertarianism is really just basically a radical strain of liberalism. It's like if you took liberal philosophy and just kicked it into overdrive, that's what it is. Now, that's obviously not the way most people look at it today, because of this kind of right-wing populist insurgency in the party. But it's worth noting, Dylan, like, this movement transcends electoral politics. It's like a philosophy and a way of looking at things. There are plenty of these people that are still working in prominent think tanks, that are still working in mainstream political organizing and political campaigns. So these people that came out of this movement, they're not going to go anywhere, and they're still going to influence culture and society in a different way. And I think that's where the influence matters. The electoral stuff, we live in a two-party system. Like, whether we like it or not, that's where we are. And until you have, you get rid of the plurality takes all voting system, and you implement maybe like ranked choice voting, you're going to see the two-party system. And that's probably not going to break, because that's a consequence of the way our electoral system works. And so I think the impact on politics will be marginal. But I hope that the influence culturally doesn't wane, because I do think, like you, I think it's an important thing to think about, like thinking about individual liberty first. So I'm a little optimistic right now, a little bit more than maybe some people. But that's part of the reason is also because I'm trying to help drive that by bringing us back to a liberal movement. That's one of the reasons why we started Project Liberal.
So we'll get into Project Liberal. That'll probably be the ending pitch. We'll give you a moment so you can talk about it, and you can pitch it, and you can sell it to people. But I wanted to get into this article you wrote, and I saw some people and they loved it. Okay, they love this new article. They think that this is the exact spitball that they needed from the libertarian movement to wake people up to exactly the problem with Donald Trump's authoritarianism. And on the other end, people calling you a liberal commie sellout who is signing on to gun-grabbing Harris and her commie policies to destroy America. Who are you voting for in this election, or have you already voted?
I have already voted, early voting, and I voted for Kamala Harris. First time I voted for a Democrat in my life. And
Did you ever think you would?
If you would have asked me in 2020 if I would be voting for Kamala Harris, I would have laughed at you. And you know what, Dylan? Part of me looks back at the way that I looked at the system in 2016 and 2020, because a lot of people told me at the time that what I was doing was dangerous. And I didn't believe them, because I kind of thought Trump was just he was just a goofball that was surrounded by a bunch of Republican operatives. And I looked at him as just kind of an unserious person. And then I watched what happened on January 6th, and then read all the trove of documents that have come out since then that documented exactly what happened leading up to that. And I basically realized that a lot of those people that I didn't take seriously were probably right. But yeah, no, I never expected to be in this place. I am trying to own my mistakes. and look back and go, yeah, this guy was probably just as dangerous as a lot of people said he was. But at this point, I am making the decision this year to put that partisanship aside and kind of. I voted Democrat up and down the ballot because I look at the situation as just incredibly dangerous. I see the Republican Party is morphed into a cult and an enabling cult of this guy who's a danger to the Constitution. And I think we've got to have a strong check against him. Otherwise, I don't know what the future is going to hold.
Thank you for the $5 in the Jesse Ventura shout out chat. Of course, as always, Jesse Ventura shout out. And I also want to give a shout out to Jesse Ventura for something he doesn't get a lot of credit for when Hulk Hogan sold out the Wrestlers Union to Vince McMahon. It was Jesse Ventura that was leading the effort to make a Wrestlers Union, and he got fired by Vince because Hulk Hogan sold him out. Who did Hulk Hogan endorse, by the way? Anyway, let's get into your article. So your article is called "The Libertarian Case for Harris." What you have 4 main points here. Let me read them one after the other, and then we can break them down piece by piece. One second. Let me just bring this up on screen here. Where is it? Here it is. Okay. Point 1 is Trump violated the oath to the Constitution. Electing him again would put all of our natural rights in jeopardy. Point 2, Trump failed to deliver a libertarian agenda during his first term and pushed the GOP further away from libertarian values. Point 3, Trump has an authoritarian agenda for his next term that will be radically worse than the first. And point 4, Harris is the best strategic choice to ensure the long-term stability of libertarian ideas. So let's start with point 1. Trump violated the oath to the Constitution. Electing him again would put all of our natural rights in jeopardy. What natural rights would this put in jeopardy, and how did Donald Trump violate the Constitution in a way that you think is unforgivable or unelectable?
Yeah, so when I frame it like this, the Constitution, despite the fact that, many ANCAPs, for example, really don't like it, when I look at it objectively, and again, I'm a classical liberal, so I'm a fan of the Constitution. I look at it objectively, I say there's really been no better safeguard for our natural rights as libertarians than the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. If you look through history, that has been the greatest guarantor of our rights, and it's done an effective job of protecting them with errors. Sure, nothing's perfect.
And when our rights are expanded to new people and reinterpreted, the Constitution and the Bill of Rights are used as a foundation to do so.
Exactly right. So I have no desire to get rid of it, to undermine it. I think it must be protected with intense fervor and focus. So I look at what he did on January 6th as an effort to subvert the Constitution, the rules of the Constitution. And you know what? I don't look at, in the article, I don't look at whether January 6th was an insurrection or a riot, because I think that's irrelevant. I don't look at whether spreading election fraud is dangerous. It is, but it's not a conversation to be had. I point directly to the fake elector scheme, because I documented all this in the article. When you really look at what the team was saying behind the scenes, they knew that they were engaging in fraud. They knew that Biden, if the election was certified according to the constitutional order, Biden would have won. A judge called it a coup in search of a legal theory. And Trump, and really the only reason why we moved forward with the election was because Mike Pence decided to say no to Trump and not violate his oath to the Constitution. And then you add all the other dynamics.
It's also why he's not the VP choice this time.
Exactly. And you add all the other dynamics. When you read what his advisors were saying and what his team was saying, Trump knew that Biden was going to take he was going to take an early lead, and Biden was going to catch up later as mail-in votes were counted. He knew that, right? That was told to him before the election.
Steve Bannon talked about it on his podcast, I believe.
Yeah, and Steve Bannon also said like a week before the election, that Donald Trump's plan was to declare victory regardless of the results. And I think there were a couple different comments in Jack Smith's indictment that mentioned there were other people that validated this. And then all of his fraud cases, by the way, which the RNC chairwoman said were, quote, bullshit, unquote. By the way, now the RNC chairwoman is replaced with Trump's daughter-in-law after she told him to his face it was bullshit. After he went on a tirade to basically, again, in the Jack Smith indictment, it shows that Trump personally put the effort in motion to replace these electors with fake electors. So I don't know how much your audience is international and how much they know about the way our election system works, but just briefly, every state has their own voting system, right? They administer their own elections. And when you vote for a candidate, you're not voting necessarily for the candidate, you're voting for the electors. So you're voting for the electors that then go to Congress on January 6th, and then those electors represent your vote for that state, and then the Congress certifies it. So what Trump did objectively was personally put a plan in motion that he knew was fraudulent, that he knew was criminal, to throw out the electors, the votes of the people in these states, and replace them with fake electors, many of which did not even know they were being inserted into a criminal scheme. Many of them didn't know. And when they did find out, they were replaced by Trump's own team in order to subvert the Constitution and introduce and basically overthrow the election. And the only reason why we didn't have a constitutional crisis on January 6th was because Mike Pence said no. And now Donald Trump's replaced Mike Pence, as you said, with J.D. Vance, who has gone on the record saying, Mike Pence did the wrong thing, and I would submit false electors. Not a single vice presidential candidate in the history of the country has asserted the authority to throw out electors. Not a single one. It is complete. It is based on a fake legal theory. It's a criminal scheme. His entire goal that he personally put in motion and personally tracked was to overturn the legal votes of these individuals in the swing states that voted for Joe Biden. I think that's unforgivable. Trump's legal team has not disputed anything in this indictment, by the way. Nothing. They've not disputed it. They basically just pushed Jack Smith to push the release of this until after the election, so it wouldn't hurt him. And I say in the article that Trump if you look at objectively, I think Trump put more effort into his criminal scheme to overthrow the election than any other one of his legislative priorities during his first term in office. He invested more emotional energy in trying to subvert the Constitution because he's a malignant narcissist that can't handle losing than like anything he did to deliver for the American people. It's just so patently authoritarian. It's so patently disqualifying. And then J.D. Vance in the mix makes it profoundly dangerous if he gets elected again, because I can't imagine what BS legal theory his team's going to cook up in 2028.
And you know what's wild about this election and how much Trump has changed the political dynamic is if Mitt Romney in 2012, after losing, came out and said the election was stolen from me by the deep state, that hated Mormons or whatever, and they just didn't want me to win and they're going to steal it, he would have been laughed out of the room. His political career would be done. He probably wouldn't be a senator because his state would be embarrassed by him. But now, we're going into this election, and we saw the Madison Square Garden rally, and Tucker Carlson was already laying the groundwork. He's saying, oh, yeah, Harris is going to get 85 million votes, the most in it. Yeah, the population grows, and so the vote numbers grow. What did you expect? And they're already laying the groundwork for it. But you could see these signs back in 2015. You could see it back in 2020 when in advance he was saying it was going to be rigged. And back in the day, this would be political poison. But today, now it's just the standard on the other side of the aisle. And it feels like either Republicans have to explain it away or just ignore it entirely.
And that is actually something I touch on in my other follow-up sections of my argument, which is the reason why Trump is so profoundly dangerous is because he's transformed the Republican Party into a cult of personality around him. So in the past, Mitt Romney did not have a cult of personality. He'd have people in the Republican Party criticize what he does, and they'd be fine. He's not going to go after them and try to primary them or throw them out.
He also didn't have an ego the size of a mountain. I don't know if you've read any of his writings about how the election affected him, but he would run on the treadmill after his failures because he felt such self-loathing every time he had a campaign misstep, like with the binders full of women. He would run endlessly on the treadmill because he felt bad about it. Trump doesn't have that inclination.
Yeah, and that is a good thing. That's a human thing. Honestly, I think, feeling shame if you screw something up or do something wrong, something that is profoundly normal, and you should embrace that. The alternative with Trump just basically lying and lying and lying and lying, and it is obviously narcissism, really, really serious narcissism. And it shows he cannot take responsibility for any of his mistakes. He's never wrong. Everyone else is wrong around him. I think that's just, from a character perspective, I didn't even touch on this on the article, but from a character perspective, that's incredibly dangerous to have as a leader. You need somebody with self-reflection. You need somebody who's a human, who can understand their mistakes and fix them. Otherwise, you get into a situation where you're repeating mistakes over and over again. And at the scale of countries in the largest economy in the world, that's really dangerous, a really dangerous instinct.
We were talking about like damage to natural rights, and we haven't talked about this quote yet, but I feel like we have to. When Trump called for the suspension and termination of the Constitution, which I feel like if we believe, as we both do, that is one of the ultimate guarantors in the United States of natural rights, I feel like we have to read this. One second, let me bring up this quote and read it in full. So with the revelation of massive and widespread fraud and deception and working closely with big tech companies, the DNC and the Democratic Party, do you throw the presidential election results of the 2020 out and declare the rightful winner, or do you have a new election? I like that. That's the only two options. A massive fraud of this type and magnitude allows for the termination of all rules, regulations, and articles, even those found in the Constitution. Our great founders did not want and would not condone false and fraudulent elections. How did the Republican Party, which was, I mean, up until recently kind of seen as the constitutionalist party, the one that would fight for tradition and conservative foundations, saying, hey, before we throw out this thing on the Second Amendment, before we throw this out or throw that out, let's pause and remember why it was instituted in the first place. How did it go from that to excusing a call for the termination of the Constitution?
I don't know. I mean, I could say that I think it goes back to this cult, man. I mean, like every single person who was kind of a principled constitutional conservative that criticized Trump in any way ended up getting thrown out of the party. They ended up getting primaried or attacked by Trump, or their opponent was endorsed, or they were replaced from their position. And I think that's when you're doing that. I mean, dude, it's been 8 years since Trump ran the first time. He's owned the Republican Party. He's carved it out. Again, his daughter-in-law being in charge of the RNC should be the clearest thing you can imagine. I mean, she's the one in control of the money bags, right? So this is a very dangerous thing because, again, it is a cult of personality. Anyone who is a true constitutional conservative wants to call that out is thrown out of the party. And many of the people that I've respected have done one of two things. They've either left the Republican Party and called it out for what it is, or they've played nice and they've bought into the cult and they've stuck with it. And that I look at as like the ultimate litmus test, because people are, I might get made fun of for saying this, but like I came up in my political, the thing that activated me politically was the Tea Party movement. I now see the dangers of populism and a lot of these things I don't buy into anymore, but that was it. There were a lot of good small government conservatives that came out of the movement. There were a lot of bad authoritarians that have come out of that movement. But many of the people I've respected the most, people like Congressman Justin Amash, he was basically cast out of the Republican Party. He left and went third party. And there are many of those people, Joe Walsh now is campaigning for Kamala Harris. And all these other people, you like Mark Stanford and now Mike Pence, and now even Liz Cheney, for God's sake. I mean, these people are just thrown out of the party. So they've turned it into a cult of personality. And when you do that, it doesn't matter what the great leader says. Nothing can be questioned. So he could call for the most egregious thing, the termination of the Constitution, and you're going to stay in lockstep.
I did like a tad bit sparring with Justin Amash a little bit over support for Ukraine on the outskirts of the LibertyCon. It was fun. And he's somebody that I can tell is principled. And even when you disagree with him, you can understand where he's coming from. But I mean, I remember when he talked about his family members passing away from the bombing of Gaza. And that was something that I really felt a lot of sympathy for. I really sympathized with him. But it's also something that I know is a big break from the Republican Party, the highlighting of this. And it shows somebody who stands for principle no matter national boundaries. And that's something that I respect quite a lot.
He is absolutely a principled candidate. He and I have spoken about the Ukraine thing because I disagree with him on that. Like, I think that it's completely acceptable under a libertarian philosophical framework for Congress to allocate aid to help us defend our friends and our allies.
Especially considering made previous agreements that if you give up your nukes for our security, we expect some support in response.
100%. And so I've talked to him about this, but I know for a fact he's principled. I mean, the thing that this shows my age a little bit. I'm 30 now. When I was 18, it was like right when Facebook was coming, or like when I was like 16, it was like right when Facebook started becoming big. The one thing he used to do, which was so cool at the time, now it's like I wish more candidates did this. He used to write a detailed paragraph on every single vote he took in Congress and post on his Facebook page, which at the time was totally novel. It was like, there's this new tech called Facebook where we can talk to each other on social media, and this congressman will like explain every vote he took. And that was pretty cool because he obviously, when you read through what he said, he was very principled.
Especially when most people's like familiarity with it was, here's the party whip, he's come over, he's told you where to vote, and then that's the way you voted. And so contrasting that with, I'm going to think out every single vote, in the amount of time it takes, most Congress people still don't do that.
No. Well, they couldn't because they don't know what they're voting for. They just vote for the party line. He was clear. I mean, dude, there was a story that came out like 2012 or 2011 where he said that he cried. He literally broke down and cried because he had like a flight cancellation and missed a vote in Congress. And he felt like he failed his constituents. That goes back to the Mitt Romney instinct of just kind of caring about this so much that it causes you personal turmoil when you maybe misstep. That's totally human, man. That's good. But he was thrown out of the party for that. So the Republican Party, there's nobody left like that in the Republican Party at this point.
Let's move on to some of the other points you have here. The next one was Trump failed to deliver a libertarian agenda during his first term and pushed the GOP further away from libertarian values. Now, let me play a little bit of a MAGA's advocate here. He cut taxes. He didn't grab the guns. He didn't, do the crazy Democrat policies. What do you mean he didn't do libertarian values?
So he did. I think the only libertarian thing he did was cut taxes. They also say he deregulated, but when you actually look at Trump, like the net new regulations added during Trump's administration, he added $40 billion of new regulations during his 4 years in office, about $10 or $11 billion a year in net new regulations. So you can't even say he was a deregulator because really the only thing you could give him is that he regulated less than previous administrations. Like he added fewer net new regulations, but he did add new regulations. He also passed more gun control than any president, at least in the last 20 years. He banned bump stocks and he pushed red flag laws. I remember in 2018, there was like a national Republican effort to pass red flag laws, one of which was in my state of Tennessee. And he told Mike Pence he wants to take the guns first and go through due process second. But I actually looked at it in 2016 very similarly the way I look at it now. This guy was not a libertarian. He was like he was a nationalist, right? He mainstreamed protectionism. He was the most fiscally reckless president in the history of the country, even more than Joe Biden.
Not only is he mainstream protectionism, right now he's like the #1 champion in the United States for protectionism.
That's right. And the Republican Party was a free trade party before he came around. I mean, Ronald Reagan, with all of his faults, was a free trade guy. Like he did push for more tearing down of trade barriers. That was something that he did. And that was the Republican Party mainstay until he destroyed that. Free trade sits at the center of libertarian philosophy. If you actually believe that people should have economic freedom, then you mean that you believe that the government shouldn't put barriers in place for people to engage in commerce and trade with each other. And then on top of that, a tariff is a tax. It's not the countries don't pay it. The importers pay it. It's a tax on American importers.
How much of a problem is it that most people don't know this?
It's kind of shocking to me. But I mean, Trump himself doesn't seem to know this. He's said this over and over again. And it's almost like when you watch what Trump said in like the 80s and the 90s, he seemed to actually understand it more than he does now. And now he's literally just peddling falsehoods. Strategic tariffs on, like, for example, you want to protect the American domestic steel industry to make sure that we have wartime capacity, and you want to implement a strategic tariff on Chinese steel. I disagree with the argument because I think it doesn't actually work the way that protectionists think it does, but I get it, okay? I get the argument. Now, universal tariffs, are profoundly, they're a universal tax on everything. It's like a universal sales tax that is incredibly regressive because nothing is protected. I mean, like in Tennessee, we don't have an income tax. We have a statewide sales tax. But you know what's protected from that? Groceries and food, right? Like in those cases, you're not paying this. You can write some of those taxes off because we don't want to say for lower income people, raise their prices for food or basic income if they don't have anything coming in. Now, regressive tax is across the board. Every single thing is taxed. It bleeds through the entire economy because you tariff steel, then everything that makes steel is then goes up in prices. If you tariff food, then every dish that is included in that goes up in price. And when you look at the net, and we could talk about the future, but like when you look at what he did, just mainstreaming the pro-tariff idea in the GOP was profoundly dangerous. And then on top of that too, Dylan, he was not, they always say stuff like he didn't start any new wars and he was like the pro-peace candidate.
Quickly on the tariffs, can we also just quickly say that this has a disproportionate impact on low-income people? Because if you're very wealthy, paying an extra $1 or $2 on this stuff isn't going to have a big impact on you. Now, a percentage tax, that's going to be different because that's a percentage. That's not like a flat rate but these tariffs are going to have, when it comes for and people just think about it like, okay, you import this like Chinese thing off Temu and it's going to cost a little bit more. It's cheap anyway. No, it's not only that stuff. It's going to be the inputs for industry, because unless every single component for a device you're making in the United States for the American manufacturing that we hear so much that we want to bring back to the United States, unless every single component is made within the United States, which is highly unlikely in the modern world, the prices are going to increase. And that means taking away consumer power. And that consumer power is more valuable for the people who don't have a lot of it, largely low-income people.
Yeah, and I do realize I did misspoke. For Tennessee, the sales tax rate is lower than the sales tax rate for other products. So it's the same kind of concept, right? Like you have a lower, you can pick and choose with, say, a sales tax, which products are taxed higher than others to make sure it's less regressive. So correcting the record on that, but with a tariff, you cannot. It is a universal across the board tax that bleeds into everything. It hurts the poorest people first. As prices go up, it hurts the poorest people first. So it's really, really, really damaging. And you know, there was an organization that did an analysis where they took, and now we're getting into his next term, but just briefly, they took his tax proposal, like his tax cut proposal for 2024, and they synthesized it with his tariff proposal. And you look at his 2024 plan, and he's actually campaigning on raising taxes for every income group below $360,000 a year. So if you make less than $360,000 a year under Trump, he's actually campaigning on raising your taxes if you include the tariff impact. And that is a tax. You can't just come to me and be like, well, Trump wants to lower taxes. He doesn't. A tariff is a tax that you pay, and he wants to raise it on everything you buy and everything that relies on imports. And that doesn't even include the retaliatory tariffs, which we could talk about later, which are going to happen, which will raise prices on exports, which means domestic producers are going to suffer greatly. A lot of jobs will be lost because when you get into a trade war, we export a lot of stuff. That's how, you know, that's like the whole thing. You produce things and you sell to the world. This isolationist policy is terrible for jobs, and it's a tax on everyone. But I digress.
Okay, let's get to your third point, and that has to do with let's stay on the second point for a second longer. Why didn't he do things like pardon Julian Assange or do all these things that like libertarians and others were like hoping he would move to do, that we heard so much like, oh, well, maybe he'll move? Where was these moves to make inroads into the Libertarian Party, especially since Trump is going and speaking at the convention? He's trying to win their votes. I think the closest like commitment he made was freeing the person who ran Silk Road. I think that's the closest we've gotten.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, when Trump didn't, the people he did pardon were his criminal co-conspirators. He pardoned people like Steve Bannon, who stole $25 million from Trump supporters. He pardoned Paul Manafort and Elliot Brody, who were trying to influence Trump on behalf of Russia and China. He pardoned Roger Stone. He pardoned Kushner. Charles Kushner is Ivanka's father-in-law, who got caught for tax evasion. He pardoned Mike Flynn. Same thing, right? So he didn't pardon anyone. Well, there were some. Actually, I take this back. There were some pardons related to like drug crimes and stuff, which I think were good. But he didn't. I mean, like when you look at what he did, he just basically used the pardon as a blank check.
What's
to bail out his
crazy is
criminals.
all of like the criminal justice reforms that he did is the stuff that his most devout base, at least those with power, now resent from his first term. They're like, those were mistakes. We shouldn't have done that.
Yeah, I don't look at it. I actually think the real narrative though on his first term that I think is important to dispel, because I mean that's obvious. I think he runs the United States like a mob boss, right? He uses the power of the pardon to help people out that are willing to engage in criminality on his behalf. That's objectively true based on what he did. But like the foreign policy stuff, I think is really clear. I mean, he did pardon somebody who got in trouble for like killing Iraqi civilians as like a Blackwater contractor and some weird stuff. But when you look at like what he did foreign policy wise, dude, he killed hundreds of times more people than Joe Biden did in drone strikes. I don't know if you know this, but like the majority of his vetoes, like 5 out of his 10 vetoes, were on legislation that limited his war making power. And then he also ended transparency rules on drone strikes. So we don't know exactly
increasing drone strikes.
Exactly. So we don't know exactly how many people he killed. And you know what happened with that transparency rule is he gave the CIA the ability to start unilaterally carrying out drone strikes without executive oversight. Which, I mean, we talk about fighting the deep state, but you're going to give the CIA the unfettered ability to drone strike people. It's like completely deranged to say this guy was somehow fight the deep state, libertarian, whatever, you know.
I know this is a little bit of a deviation, but one thing that is crazy that Biden didn't get the credit for, which I mean, it makes sense in retrospect, because when people talk about foreign policy and like how they're going to make moral stances on votes on foreign policy, a lot of it's performative, but Biden nearly ended the drone war. I mean, the amount of drone strikes that he's done in comparison to Donald Trump or in comparison to Barack Obama, I mean, it's uncomparable. It's like on a capacity of like 1 to 20th the scale.
Yeah, I have the numbers here. It's fewer than 500 documented drone strikes under Biden, and Trump had, according to Air Wars, 18,641 drone strikes.
It's incomparable.
So, I mean, there's no comparison. So I mean, like, if you're going to objectively look at the facts, Biden was like the pro-peace candidate. He ended the war in Afghanistan. The drone wars ended. I mean, Trump killed 13,000 people allegedly with drone strikes. Biden killed 40. So like that's moving in the right direction.
And I know they don't give credit on this. He's kept troops out of Ukraine. That was a commitment he made at the start of the war, and everything he's given to Ukraine so far has been military and financial support, mostly military support. Correct.
So I mean, if you look objectively at the record, especially his first term, Trump failed to deliver on any libertarian agenda. Any say otherwise is pretty much gaslighting. The only thing you can give him is tax cuts, which are, you know, I think the corporate tax rate should be declined. I think that's a good thing. So I think that, because I think it leads to economic growth. So I think that was a good decision. But in the aggregate, no. And the real danger, before we move on to the third point, was that the Republican Party, because we talked about at the beginning of this call, was a fusionist, right? So like the libertarians looked at the Republican Party as their best shot to influence and move towards a libertarian direction. Trump basically co-opted libertarians, convinced them anti-libertarian positions are libertarian positions, and then pulled the party farther away from that. So like I thought in 2016, the best way to save the libertarian movement was to make sure Trump couldn't win, because then you could have 4 years later, you could try to actually introduce a candidate that was more libertarian aligned, because he was farther away from libertarian values than any other candidate before.
Let me put a little bit of disagreement out there. I don't think the tax cuts were a good idea. I think they were a bad idea. Because if you do massive tax cuts and then find no way to replace those losses in income, you do massive deficit increases, and Trump massively increased the deficit as a supposedly, according to him, peacetime president. And so that's another thing that's really bothered me about this election. Fiscal conservatism is no longer a priority of the Republican Party. If you poll Republicans on it, it's not a top issue. Spending in any capacity is not a top issue. And if you look at the promises that Trump is making now, and he's making a ton of promises at the end of the campaign as Harris has caught up with him. So, I mean, like the deficit he is projected by economists to make is almost impossible to believe that it is the mainstream Republican Party candidate that is proposing it. And so, like, is fiscal conservatism dead within the Republican Party?
Yeah, 100%. When you looked at his record, because I agree with you, by the way. I mean, if you're going to cut taxes, you also have to cut spending. You can't have it one way or the other. If you do if you just cut taxes and then you ramp up spending, which is what Trump did. He spent more. He increased the federal budget more than Obama did in 2 terms. He added more to the debt than Biden did, right, in 10-year debt. Than Biden did in 1 term. He did, and that's even if you strip out COVID spending. By the way, this is not COVID. Like, this is pre-COVID numbers. He absolutely was the most fiscally reckless president the United States has ever seen. And he pulled the Republican Party to a point where they just don't care about that anymore because it's kind of this cult mindset. I think it's really dangerous. Between him and Biden was the fiscal conservative, and that's saying a lot.
That is saying something.
In spending, in debt, right? It's crazy.
Okay, up to the third point. Trump has an authoritarian agenda for his next term that will be radically worse than the first. Something I hear a lot is like people talked about Trump being Orange Hitler first term, but then we got no Orange Hitler, and now you're saying Orange Hitler again. This seems like a crock of shit. What would you say to that?
Well, we talked about it at the beginning. I think January 6th, if anyone's confused about Trump's desire to subvert the constitutional restrictions on the power, there's no better example of his fake elector scheme that shows his willingness to engage in criminality to do so. There's also a couple other dynamics to think about. When Trump got elected in 2016, the Republican Party had not been carved out into a cult. Okay, so he came into office with this kind of slate of traditional Republican operatives that kind of he ended up all calling stupid or whatever later, and they were all terrible people that he hired. That party is fundamentally different from the character of the operatives in the party to right now, which is 8 years later, where all these people have left the Republican Party. And they're not. And there was an entire war within the administration, which you can read about, between the economic globalists and the economic isolationists. So these are the traditional Republican free traders versus this kind of new crop of national conservative isolationists. The isolationists won in his campaign, and isolationism as an economic and a foreign policy agenda is the dominant policy now. And then you add all the criminality and all that stuff, and I think it proves that he's fundamentally transformed. But there's no better example for me of Trump's desire to enact an authoritarian agenda than 2 things. The first thing is his promise to use the Alien and Sedition Acts to round up and deport millions of peaceful immigrants. I mean, he's promised this mass deportation
Which, if I remember correctly, was also the policy that was used to intern the Japanese.
That's right. Now, here's something that I think your viewers need to think about. The president already has broad authority to enforce immigration law. Okay, so like the president doesn't need the Alien and Sedition Acts as an authority to enforce immigration law. That's not something he needs. The Alien and Sedition Acts specifically give him the power it's a wartime power that gives him the ability to detain and arrest American citizens from foreign adversaries without any due process. So there's a specific reason he's invoking that act. It's not because he needs that extra authority. If he intended just to enforce immigration law, he could do that according to executive power. He doesn't need this ability to arrest American citizens. That's what this Alien Sedition Acts give him the ability to do, right? So that's profoundly dangerous. It's not only economically disastrous to deport 11 million people, it'll throw us into recession, like 5% GDP reduction immediately. But the fact that he's calling for the Alien and Sedition Acts, I think objectively prove he's got a more malicious intent here.
And the thing that gets me is the whole pitch was, I'm fine with immigration, but you got to do it legally. We're going to deport everyone who came here illegally. But if you're reintroducing the Alien Sedition Act, that gives you a pathway to deport people who are here as American citizens. That means they've gone through the process.
I posted a tweet about this that kind of went a little viral, and I'm sorry if you're hearing my kids in the background. They just got home. But I posted a little tweet about this that went a little bit viral. There's 3 promises that Trump's making. He wants to end birthright citizenship. He wants mass deportations, and he wants to use the Alien and Sedition Acts to enforce them. If you look at all those 3 things together, then if he does achieve those 3 things, then the world that we could see is a world where birthright citizenship is ended. And then people are coming to me because he wants to use the military to go house to house, right, to round up all these immigrants, to check to make sure that I have some sort of proof of legal status, that my family at some point in my lineage have come here legally. because to prove I'm not a anchor baby, right? I hate that term, but you get my point. Like prove I'm not here in a way that's not appropriate with birthright citizenship. And then Alien Sedition Acts allow him to arrest and detain American citizens without trial. And you're literally looking at, again, the most authoritarian proposal you can imagine. I mean, military checking your papers. I couldn't imagine anything more, a la the Nazis than that. That's crazy to me.
I mean, Trump loved the idea of using the military in any capacity. I mean, like if he could use the military to deliver mail, he would, it feels like. But the thing, like, it's such an inhuman policy. Somebody's born here. They know nothing but the United States. They might not even speak like the language of their father's country. They've only known the United States. They've gone to American schools. They watched American football. They ate American apple pie. They watched the same cartoons as the rest of us, Dexter's Laboratory and the rest. And now they're going to be deported to a country that they don't know anything about the culture. It might be extremely dangerous, gang-ridden, and could be violence in the middle of... They have no clue. They might not have basically any ties to the country, and they're going to be stranded there. And those countries, I don't even know if those countries want them. And many of these people like provide valuable services in the United States. Many of them have gone through the education system. We've paid to educate them. And so we're taking this investment that we've made as a society after paying our taxes to educate these people so they can pay into Social Security and help us fund, the elderly's programs that they need to be able to survive and fund future generation when Social Security already has a fiscal crisis amongst it. And we're just going to deport them for what reason? What safety are we enforcing by deporting these people? It feels like being hardline for hardline's sake.
Yeah, I mean, it's really inhuman. And then, another thing that's worth thinking about is, I look at all these kind of like MAGA right-wing influencers online, and they point to images of like countries like Germany and France. And I'm not familiar with the nuances of all the laws, but if you look at the aggregate of European immigration, right, they don't have birthright citizenship. Birthright citizenship, the nature of birthright citizenship is it leads to very effective assimilation and integration in society over multiple generations. The reason why you see these permanently kind of this underclass of immigrants that are not fully integrated in other European countries is because there's no like legal path in many cases for them, or it's much harder. So you basically, without birthright citizenship, you create a dynamic where integration over the long period of time is very difficult because these people can't really fully function in society as citizens. So it's very counterintuitive. Like if you really want to see integration of these immigrant communities into American society, if you want to see economic prosperity for the United States and growth in jobs, and you want to see those things, then you embrace, you give people earned pathway to citizenship, you give their kids immediate citizenship, and you allow these people to integrate. But I don't think that's the motivation. I don't believe that. I mean, I think that these people genuinely are, many of them are motivated by racial angst about, not being the racial majority. And I do think that's a huge motivator for a lot of these people, not all of them, but a lot of these people. That's what he's tapping into.
I mean, I think a good example of this has to be, I remember in, Springfield, Ohio, we're talking about people who are legally here, many of whom are coming here to do hard work in a place where the employers wanted employees, but they're having problem getting people who are not high or were willing to work and like do a hard day's work. They come over, they do the work, they buy houses and start paying off property at above market rates, and because almost as if they don't fulfill the stereotype they had of a Haitian, so they just project these stories onto them and then use it as a justification to deport them, literally making up fairy tales to deport the people who we want in this country. I mean, one of the arguments, and I thought one of the more convincing arguments from a humanitarian angle against like completely open like immigration policy, is the idea of brain drain, that there's a country that, like invests in a new person and they get an education, they start to succeed, and immediately once they get any success, they go to the place where they're going to get the most value for that knowledge. And that's going to be American markets, it's going to be European markets, that maybe Chinese, Japanese, wherever it is. And that means leaving countries like Uganda, or leaving countries like Mozambique for greener pastures. And that derives them of that valuable human capital. That I always found as a much more interesting argument. But from an American exceptionalist or an American first, quote unquote, policy standpoint, you should want those people. You
Yeah.
get to choose of the cream of the crop, and then that cream of the crop comes here and works hard because they want to be here, and then we just make a fairy tale. I mean, how long into it? Until like 2 years into a Trump term, and he's just like, yeah, the Honduran community in California is like chomping up babies, so we have to deport them. Like, if you can just make this up about Springfield, get away with it, and then deport them for just to justify Trump's lies, then I mean, like, who's safe?
Yeah, it's incredibly dangerous. And when you look at it all together with the proposals that he's putting out there, it is very disturbing to see. And again, if you believe in American exceptionalism, then and you want to see America succeed, then you should embrace that. And but to play devil's advocate on that whole argument, like the argument you hear from Trump supporters, just to make sure I say it out loud, is, well, these people are coming into the country and they're not contributing, and they're a drain on our welfare system, and they cost taxpayers money. But when you look at the study in the aggregate, immigrants are actually subsidizing, and Cato's put out plenty of studies on this. Immigrants are actually paying $1.34 into our welfare system, or into taxes, for every dollar they take out in welfare. So, like, in the aggregate, they're actually subsidizing our welfare system. It's kind of a crazy dynamic. But when you look at it, that's exactly what's happening. And so I just don't understand it. Like, the only thing if you strip away every argument, I feel like it just comes back down to kind of racial insecurity. And that's not a compelling argument to me at all, because I look at people as individuals.
On its surface, it feels like such a good transaction. They come here, and in exchange for access to American markets, American services, and the United States and the rights and liberties that come with being an American citizen, they, in exchange for that, pay more into the system, so their children and the rest of our children will be able to have the safety nets through law enforcement, through proper enforcement of basic regulations for public safety, etc., in order for us to have a prosperous existence. It feels like the best transaction you could imagine. And
exactly. Oh, and it's not zero sum, Dylan, too. One thing to think about is, like, immigrants take our jobs and take our houses in the same way you having a kid does. It doesn't. What happens is, when you have more people, they buy things, they work, they contribute to the economy, and it leads to economic growth. Like, this whole immigrants are taking our jobs thing has not been quantified in a meaningful way. It's like saying kids take our jobs. Yeah, I mean, in the future, they're going to take jobs, but you create more jobs from their demand.
Yeah, I mean, like, every immigrant needs a barber, they need a shopkeep, exactly. They need a dentist, they need an electrician, they need a plumber, they need somebody to do the tiles on their roof, they need all these things. That means extra business for the people who provide those services.
Yeah, one thing I will say, though, and this is a challenge for liberals to overcome, is there is a lot of angst around this. And I think a lot of it's motivated by the fact that we're seeing stories every day with Texas shipping these immigrants to communities like Chicago and New York City, where these people are showing up and they have no housing.
What's that one place, the Vineyard? Forget what Vineyard it was. Yeah, Martha's Vineyard.
Yeah, Martha's Vineyard. Yeah, the Ron DeSantis did that. So these red states they're doing that. That's causing a lot of angst.
Christian, by the way, to take a bunch of people who are fleeing poverty and violence and then use them for a political ploy that they're completely unaware of.
Right. But I mean, at the center of this is, it's going to be there will be populist rage in response to a lot of this discord that happens. And if liberals can't find a way to solve the challenge, then it's only going to get worse. The problem is when, say, a conservative puts up a very strong immigration bill that tries to fix a lot of these problems, and then Trump killed you. I'm sure you've heard that story about this Republican-sponsored immigration bill that Trump destroyed because he thought it would hurt his reelection prospects. It's very difficult to solve those challenges.
It also delayed Ukraine aid for 10 months and got a lot of people killed.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, when they're putting that, when that's what you're dealing with, is a group that wants to keep a problem unsolved because it helps them, and it objectively does. Like, a broken immigration system helps the right. It's a very difficult challenge to overcome, but liberals do have to find a solution to this. I think the solution should be kind of a similar Ellis Island style immigration system, where people can come here, get legal status, pay taxes, and work. And we know who they are. And if they're committing crimes, then they're deported, or, sent back to their house or put in jail. But it's much more difficult to enforce the law and to understand the scope of how many immigrants are doing what if you don't have them come out of the shadows. And I think you have to provide them that. It's the same argument for prohibition. It's like, we're going to ban drugs and that's going to fix the problem. It's like, we're going to ban immigration. No, people want to come here. We have a great economy. People are fleeing terrible conditions.
That's a quote, by the way, chat. Joshua compares immigrants to drugs. Somebody write that down, tweet it out.
Yeah, maybe bad phrasing. Well, you get my point. It's like, you're not solving the source of the problem. The reason why people use drugs is because they might be addicted to drugs. By banning it, you don't fix anything. You don't fix the immigration problem by shooting people that come across the border or putting the military in everyone's communities. You fix the incentives that are causing them to come here to begin with, and you make them come out of the shadows so that you can understand the scope of the issue. The Republicans don't want to fix that problem, and it sounds to me like Kamala does, so I think that's a win in her camp.
Let's go through a few things. Number one, I'm hearing from like Elon that this is a First Amendment election. I don't, Donald Trump's on the side of free speech. Republicans are on the side of free speech. They're not in favor of the social media censorship. What would you say about Donald Trump being a free speech candidate?
In no reality is Donald Trump a free speech candidate. So Kamala Harris, I think the worst proposal that she's made is she's talked about maybe using the government to insert itself in the way social media companies monitor hate speech. So it's like forcing the government to insert themselves into like how social media companies do their terms of service, which I think would be a problem. But Trump's
think she'd be able to even pass that though, like filibuster wise, they implement that policy.
That's the whole thing, man. That's why I go back to, not to get off on a tangent, but like many of Trump's promises are promises that he plans to submit and achieve due to unilateral executive action. Kamala's like, hey, I want to pass these things through Congress, right? That's what she's like, let's pass this bill or that bill. That's fundamentally different. Trump has called objectively for the prosecution of Google for showing search results he dislikes. He's called to open up libel laws, right, to make it easier to sue publications. He's called to pull the broadcast licenses unilaterally from news organizations that ask him questions he doesn't like or publish things he doesn't like. He's called for jail time for people who burn American flags, which is a free speech protected activity. One of the things, though, that really shocks me, not a lot of people know about this. There's this obscure regulatory rule called Section 230. In Section 230, it basically is a rule that allows social media companies like Twitter to exist, period. It's a rule that shields social media companies.
It doesn't call them a publisher, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, it basically says that they're not liable for things that are posted on their platform in the very simple way. Trump has gone after this rule, and actually both Trump and Hillary Clinton want to remove this rule. Trump tried to veto legislation that was going to protect it during his first term. He's gone after it many times. This rule is a rule that allows Twitter to exist, period, hard stop. Without it, Elon Musk wouldn't be able to have all these crazy neo-Nazis posting things on Twitter that are resulting in people getting harmed without massive lawsuits that would shut down the company. So, like, there is no reality in which Trump is a free speech candidate. And Kamala Harris has bad proposals, some bad policy proposals on this, but I just look at it as so fundamentally different. There's just no comparison between the two.
Okay, let's move on to the final point because I know you're on a time limit and I don't want to keep you longer than you have available. The fourth point is Harris is the best strategic choice to ensure the long-term viability of libertarian ideas. Okay, let me try my very best to be a MAGA opposition figure here. Number one, she's very in favor of a reintroduction of the assault weapons ban. She's very in favor of gun control, and she talks about it quite openly. She wants to raise taxes on the wealthy. She talks about not raising taxes on the middle and lower classes. She wants to raise taxes on the wealthy. I don't care about that, but I'm sure somebody who cares about that more, like you, would be against something like that. And she has not been somebody that you would regularly call an ally of the libertarian movement. Why would you say that she is the best strategic choice instead of someone like Chase Oliver, as somebody who's been an advocate for third parties your entire life?
So Kamala Harris is definitely not a libertarian. I do not make that claim. I will never make that claim. She has a lot of bad policy proposals, the capital gains, unrealized capital gains, the gun control stuff. These are all things that I fundamentally disagree with. But I lay this out in the article. The real difference is that she hasn't demonstrated the desire to violate her oath, try to overturn an election. She has a bad slew of policy proposals, but she doesn't have an authoritarian agenda to put the military in everyone's communities and round these people up and check papers. But really, it's like a bigger strategic conversation. So like this year, Libertarians, the party, is, as we talked about earlier, they don't have 50 state ballot access. They're not even on the ballot in my state. They're polling at less than 1%. They really don't have right now a viable path to the White House. If Trump gets into office and then puts in place...
By the way, let me just stop here before you finish that sentence. Wouldn't this also equally apply to 2016 and 2020 when if I remember correctly, you did not vote for the Democratic nominee?
That's right. In retrospect, here's the difference. The difference is there is objective proof that Trump has engaged in criminality today, right? There's objective proof. And this is why I said at the beginning of the show...
Well, wait. Oh, I'm sorry. He did engage in criminality before. Donald Trump is banned from doing charity work in the state of New York because of stealing from children's cancer funds. True. No, touche. And this goes back to why I say I look back at my decisions in 2016 and 2020 through a different lens. I think that January 6th and what happened after that was so profoundly egregious that it really made me rethink the way that I even handled those two elections. So I do think that you could make that same argument to me. And actually funny, the same people that made this argument to me in 2016 that I laughed off, now I'm in that same shoe and I'm getting the same hate for it. So I understand, and I think that's a fair criticism. But like, dude, I look at that situation and I go, blatant disregard for the Constitution. The people he's bringing into his next administration are cranks. He's trying to bring in Mike Flynn, who's called for a military coup against the government. By the way, for the foreign policy nerds in chat, the specific quote is somebody comes up to him at like a QAnon rally, wild enough on its own, and they say, should we have a Myanmar? And I say Myanmar because that's what the guy said. Should we have a Myanmar in reference to Myanmar, Burma, style military coup? Which, for those of you who don't know, has led to the execution and mass rape of villages, the burning down of villages, the mass bombing of civilians in the countryside. And there is a gigantic popular people's revolt going on in the countryside, and the government is losing rapidly. And it's not because they're underfunded. It's not because they don't have a supply. The reason they're losing is because they're unbelievably unpopular because they overthrew a democratically elected government in Aung San Suu Kyi. And that is what Michael Flynn said. Yes, we should have that in the United States. IRI, thank you so much for the raid.
And he's promising to bring this guy back into his office. This is one of the guys that he pardoned who was a felon before he was pardoned. So, I mean, and then you got RFK, who believes vaccines cause autism, and he's going to put him in charge of public health. I mean, like, there's such a really profoundly dangerous...
Going to drink raw milk in American schools.
Right. I mean, there's just a really dangerous combination of people that are going to come into his next administration. And then you add the criminality. You add the lack of viability for a third-party candidate this year. And then I look at it also, I add one more point to that is, like, if we can't get this guy out of the way, then we're never going to have a Republican Party that actually does embrace the things that we talked about, free trade, limited government. I mean, gun control, as we said, he passed more gun control than either president. So if we're going to actually take that fusionist argument to its extreme and say, well, the Republican Party is our ally, then what we have to do is we have to get this guy out of the Republican Party and open up a window on the right for fiscal conservatism and individual liberty to be part of the conversation. But until that happens, this dude needs to lose. He's got to get out of the public conversation. We cannot risk having him in office again. And so for that reason, I made a strategic choice to vote for him. And I said this in the article, like, if libertarian philosophy is centered on individual liberty, then it's like a moral obligation for us this year to go, we've got to defeat this candidate who is the most the clearest example of an authoritarian that I've seen in my lifetime. We've probably seen it since the 30s. It's on us to cast the deciding vote because we can. And so that's my strategic choice, and that's my argument.
I want to ask, Barbara, thank you so much for the $5, and I appreciate all the donations for everybody in chat.
RFK Jr. eating whatever Christy Gnome shot.
Oh gosh, sorry, we're getting some insults towards RFK. I would have thought my audience would have loved that, man. Thank you so much for the $5. I wanted to ask you about Donald Trump's, because this is something that I get some pushback on, but I believe it. I think Donald Trump's lovey-dovey relationship with authoritarians throughout the world is worrying, because I think it comes from a place of admiration, not a place of, I want to have just simple, casual diplomacy, and I want to have like a Nixon style reopening with our geopolitical opponents. I think it comes from a
Yeah.
point of admiration. And I think the COVID testing machines to Putin was crazy, and the fact that didn't have an impact, considering how many people died on the polling, just shows how far the political scene has fallen. But the thing that really scares me is how close they are to Viktor Orban. The fact that Viktor
Yes.
Orban is speaking at CPAC. I mean, he sounds like Gru the whole time from Despicable Me, so it's kind of goofy, but it shouldn't be taken as goofy, because this is a guy who centralized control over the media. Donald Trump is somebody who's talking about suspending the broadcasting licenses of the media. This is somebody who is engaging in the most public sector corruption in all of the European Union. Donald Trump is somebody who has stolen from charities before, and I think he's somebody who engages in grifting quite frequently with Trump trading cards, Trump NFTs, Trump shoes, be Trump condoms, Trump whatever next, who knows. This seems like, I was raised under the idea that you judge a person by who they associate with.
Yep. Agreed. And, it's more than just that he's speaking at CPAC or that he's friendly with this guy. I mean, Trump, I'm pretty sure this is a direct quote, has said that Viktor Orban is the model for the new conservative movement. If he didn't say it, it was somebody in his orbit that did. That's profoundly dangerous. I mean, you look at Orban. He was an authoritarian. He literally celebrated the transformation of Hungary into a liberal Christian democracy, I think was his words, right? And so profoundly dangerous.
And Orban was the first person to go to Georgia to go bless the election results after widespread reports of vote rigging, vote buying, and the very type of steal that he has been talking about for the last 4 years. Even if you were to assume that Donald Trump believes what he believes about around the 2020 election, that it was stolen, how are you going to associate with somebody who's going out and blessing something that has much more evidence around the actual stealing of an election?
I mean, it's crazy. It just shows that their commitment isn't to democracy. It's not to individual freedom. It's commitment to authoritarian rule and the consolidation of power and the forcible implementation of their moral beliefs on society. And if this was a normal election where we had two candidates that had a broad commitment to the Constitution, but a handful of different policy proposals, that's just not, we'd be having a different conversation, but we just simply don't. This is not a policy a year. This is a year about like, hey, are we going to stand up for the Constitution? Are we going to stand up for the basic infrastructure of our democratic system? Or are we going to allow someone to overthrow it and undermine it? And so I put all my policy qualms with Kamala aside, and I just go, look, I've got two kids. I want them to live in a future. I want them to be able to participate in a democratic system when they become 18. I'm not going to risk it this year. Just not going to.
I want to pass the republic down to our children.
Exactly.
So I got two more questions, and then we'll wrap up.
Yes.
The first question is, now obviously, I have disagreements with you. Harris has disagreements with you. But if you could offer some type of, diplomatic flower overture, policy recommendation or campaign recommendation to Harris at this point, something she could announce in the last final days of the race to grab the headlines, what would you recommend in order to try to seal the deal and win this?
You put me on the spot with that. There's a lot of stuff that she's leaning into that I think she should lean into more. I really, really like what she's done related to trying to tear down barriers to development for housing, because I think that's one of the highest drivers right now of populist rage against the establishment is the fact that home prices are out of control. And the only way to solve
the Democratic Party's adoption of YIMBYism is very good.
Oh, dude, it's amazing. It's also economic freedom. It's like we don't need to artificially stifle this industry with like restrictive, supply restrictions. We need to open it up. That's how you lower prices for everyone. That's what we've done in all these other sectors. Do it here. So I would say like the one thing I would say in the aggregate is I want to see an economically liberal, economically free agenda kind of spread out through other sectors. Now, there's a lot of other things I think she could lean into that also would do well with the left, which one thing that I haven't heard her talk about is issues like civil forfeiture. That's an issue that's important to me. I think it's like legalized theft. She's already got this broad agenda to like reform police and things like that. That would probably resonate pretty well with the left. And it's a really libertarian policy solution that would throw them a huge bone. I'm also, like the Jones Act. I'd love to see her probably get rid of the Jones Act, which I don't know if you're familiar with how that works, but that really just drives up maritime shipping costs and makes everything a lot more expensive. It's really bad during disasters. And then lean less into here's the thing though. I personally want to see a humanitarian solution to the immigration system, but all the political incentives for Kamala Harris are her to get tough on immigration because it's the driver for the populist right. So she's trying to undermine that. I get it.
But can you out-Trump Trump on immigration? I don't know if this is really possible.
No, she's kind of doing, like, she's trying, and she, in a lot of ways, has really driven a great wedge on that whole immigration bill that Trump killed. But, like, I want to see a humanitarian solution. So, like, I get why she's talking about that. But this is not political advice. It's more just like me from a policy perspective. That's what I like to see. And I'd like to see her running more on, like, let's fix the deficit. Let's lower debt. Let's get our budget under control. Rather than let's spend less than Trump.
All the political incentives are against it. You do all this effort to bring the deficit under control just to make a fiscal foundation for the next guy to come in and spend all that money away on programs you disagree with.
Yeah. I mean, you're right. And that typically is kind of the way, if you actually look back at the fiscal policy of like the Republicans and Democrats, is like the Democrats have kind of worked to solve the deficit in some ways, and the Republicans come and blow it up, and then the Democrats got to fix it again. It's kind of crazy. I mean, the only person in our lifetime that's balanced the budget was Bill Clinton, right? So, yeah, I mean, I get it. I'd like to see her lean into that more, though. I think that resonates a lot with fiscal conservatives. And then I'm trying to think if there's anything else. I really love the foreign policy stuff that she's leaning into. I really do think that this is a very important issue in this moment to stand up against authoritarian dictators around the world. I don't want to see a policy of regime change. I don't want to see a repeat of George W. Bush. I want to see we're going to stand with our allies and we're going to stand strong for democratic.
A defensive democratic policy where it's talking about defending the democracies that we have instead of going off to countries and trying to implement social change that is not necessarily having a great chance of success or even wanted by the local population. I do want to say, though, quickly, I think that this is also an area where the question is, how do you differentiate yourself from Biden? That's something that keeps getting asked. This is an area where she could take a stronger stance on the issue of support for Ukraine or any number of foreign policy issues. If she's asked, like, what do you want to do differently? And she says, I think that we need to move towards ending the war in Ukraine through strength, not through submission like Donald Trump. This is like a pitch where she could move forward. And even if Biden might disagree with it, Biden's not going to be president in 2 months.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that actually has been problematic for her because she's trying to have her cake and eat it too. She's trying to run like she's the incumbent, but also like she's got a new vision for the United States. And so I think that's been hard. But I understand the reasoning. It's like she can't really crap all over Biden and talk about, you know what I mean? Like she's kind of damned if she does and damned if she doesn't. But no, I think that'd be good. But I really would be great to see, and I don't think she's going to do this, is that criminal justice reform stuff. I love to see the fact she's come out and said she wants to legalize weed, but like there could be a much bigger comprehensive.
Created like no splash, by the way. I don't know if it's because they didn't invest the time to put that in advertising in swing states or something, but they made like no splash.
It feels like it's become less of an issue, mainly because of, actually, ironically, Trump's farm bill loophole. Like, I don't know if you know this. I'm in the deep south. I'm in Tennessee. I can go buy THC weed at a gas station now or at a dispensary because they have this loophole that allows them to sell like Delta 8, Delta 9 THC variants, and it's not regulated by the state.
Yeah, that's how I was able to try weed for the first time, is because weed was illegal, but it wasn't. As a kid, it was great.
So I feel like the issue in a lot of places is a big ticket off the table because many police aren't really enforcing it. And a lot of states, like in the deep south, they already have it because of this loophole. It's not a long-term solution, but I think that might be why it's maybe making less of a splash than it was like 4 years ago.
Barbara, thank you for the $5. I am happy to inform you that you're saying this, oh, she can do this by firing Jake. Jake Sullivan's going to be fired if Harris becomes president. The rumor is that Jake's going to go, Anthony Blinken's going to go, Secretary of State Lloyd Austin's going to go. She's going to sweep everyone and replace him. With Obama era appointees, likely, in my opinion, but we'll see who that is. Last question. What was the reaction to your article from the libertarian space? Because I was looking at some of those comments, some of those quote tweets, and some of them were like, this is our manifesto, and others were saying, this is a betrayal of everything libertarian.
You know, it's funny. I actually posted it over the summer, a picture of me and my wife with our kids, and I said something like, you know, we buy locally sourced beef, we mine Bitcoin, we're gun owners, we're conservative, we have conservative beliefs, and we're voting for Kamala. And this post got like 1 million views and everyone lost their mind. A lot of libertarians were very mad at me about it. And that actually led me to sit down and actually really write this whole thing out. And this took me a long time because I had to research all the details about the last 8 years of these two candidates and put it out in clear documented format with linked sources. I'm going to be honest with you, Dylan. I've gotten to the point where I don't really read all those comments because there's so many of them. The way that I handle social media nowadays is I have my people that I know I trust their opinion. Some of them don't always agree with me, but I know that I respect their views, and those are the people that I look to, and I will ask or listen to their feedback, and then all the rest is noise. Okay, so the people that I have great respect for seem to take it very well. And the people that are always in my DMs shitting on me did what they normally do. And so I thought it was positive. I mean, it was overall, it got a lot of engagement. And I think it reached 250,000, 400,000 people. So I just feel like I wanted to put my case out there and hopefully maybe win over a couple voters before the election day. And I think I hopefully achieved at least changing someone's vote. So
thank you so much for coming on and talking to me today about this. I appreciate it. It's not easy to schedule content out here, so it is very useful. What's this Project Liberal thing? That'll be, I know I said it was the last question, but I want to give you this pitch period.
Yeah, so I believe that in the United States, we're in the middle of a political realignment. I think that the coalitions that we talked about at the beginning of this call that made up the world that you and I grew up in, this kind of Reagan conservative libertarian alliance against the left, this is not the political coalition that is going to be that will underpin the Western civilization going forward for the next 50 years. And a lot of political scientists agree with me. I believe that the new political coalitions that are going to make up the two major poles in American society are effectively a liberal cosmopolitan coalition of people that believe in free trade and dynamism and openness and innovation and pluralism versus populists on both the far left and the far right. You could think about horseshoe theory, right? You've got kind of people like Hassan and Nick Fuentes, both on the kind of the same team. A lot of, in many cases, like when you really look at the way their politics materialize in the world, right? And so I think it's going to be a populist authoritarian coalition versus a liberal coalition. We started this project with the hopes of trying to bring people across the political spectrum together to fight for liberal values and remind people what liberalism is, why it matters, and hopefully galvanize people's desire to defend America's liberal tradition. And so we're about to redo our website, and we're actually launching a new nonprofit in the next month. You could learn more at projectliberal.org. But yeah, that's the 10,000 foot view on why we started it.
Thank you so much for coming on today. I know that you have a busy schedule. We all have a busy schedule. The election's right around the corner. But I do appreciate you making the time. It really is useful, and I always enjoy your perspective and talking to you, Joshua. And I hope to see you when I'm back in the States at some point.
Absolutely, man. The feeling is mutual. Please stay safe. Thanks again for having the conversation, and we'll see what happens in the next week. Hopefully we come back on the other side with some hope. So
amen, brother.
Thanks again, bro.
Okay, see you later. Bye-bye.
Hey, buddy. Bye-bye.
Whoa, what a conversation, boys. What a conversation. Hope you're all doing well.